we don't want to depress everybody here, but I mean, there is a happy tone to the book. And the characters, you kind of get a glimpse of them in your next book, Until Leaves Fall in Paris. So, okay, but that is fast forward just a little bit, correct? In the time. So tell us about that.
Yes. So the characters, character Peter Lang went to college with his friend Paul Aubrey, who is actually a bit character in When Twilight Breaks. So it's not a series. The books aren't related to each other, but I do have the characters making some cameos. And so Paul Aubrey is the hero of Until Leaves Fall in Paris. And this story is set in Paris, like the title says, and starts in 1940, kind of more of a prologue where it opens when France is falling. And then it runs through 1941. And the question that inspired that story was that I was researching, were there Americans in Paris under the Nazis? Because I just written about Americans in Nazi Germany. And I had another story in mind, which is the one that comes out next year, which is was an American in Nazi occupied Denmark. And I knew I wanted to write that. Like, well, were there Americans? And turned out there were thousands of Americans who remained. So between June 1940, when Hitler invaded and conquered France, up until December 1941, that was a year and a half, America was neutral. So we weren't at war with Germany. We weren't part of the Allies. Americans were free to come and go. So very interesting time period, because they had a lot of freedoms. They were still under the restrictions. They had to follow all the laws in place. They were subject to the rationing restrictions, which were pretty severe in France. So they had all the hardships that the French were facing, but they had something the French didn't, which was the freedom to leave. And the fact that as of December 1941, there were still 2,000 Americans in Paris. And that was kind of astonishing. That was astonishing to me. Why would you stay when you had the freedom to leave? And so the question was, well, why would somebody stay? So I created these two characters and they're based off of the real type of stories, the real reasons that Americans did stay. And people stayed for a variety of reasons. They stayed for artistic reasons. Those who were part of the Bohemian artistic community in Paris, there was so much more freedom artistically in Paris than there was in America, though that obviously changed under the Nazis. So there was still surprisingly a lot of artistic freedom under the Nazis, because they kind of wanted France to feel like France. Weird. The Germans were kind of weird. So it's like they didn't allow jazz music in Germany, but they allowed it in France. Like, all right then. Like, the French are gonna be French. So the German soldiers would go to these jazz clubs, like, ooh, look, we're being naughty. We're going to jazz clubs. So there's a lot of hypocrisy there. But anyway, so some people stayed for artistic reasons. Some people stayed for business reasons. They had a company there. They were making money. The Germans had money just as much as the French did. Why not stay? There were some who stayed because they were married to French people. A lot of people who stayed just because they had literally lived in France all their lives and they saw themselves more as French than Americans. They didn't really have a home in America. They didn't have people in America. All their people were in France. So there were all these different reasons. So Lucy Gerard is loosely based off of Sylvia Beach, who ran Shakespeare and Company. Sylvia was an American woman who started this English language bookstore in Paris's left bank Bohemian artistic community in the 1920s. And it was the home to all these literati. It was Ernest Hemingway's favorite watering hole. And so it was like a home for the American expats in the 20s and 30s. Well, Sylvia Beach did not leave. She stayed throughout the entire war. And she kept her bookstore open until December 1941. That was interesting to me. So that inspired the character of Lucy Gerard. She also, I created my own bookstore so I could have my own character. So she has her own English language bookstore, but she gets it for different reasons. She starts off as a ballerina, but she buys the bookstore because her dear friends own the bookstore, but they're Jewish and they do want to leave. They're Americans and they want to leave. But all their money's tied up in the store. So Lucy buys the bookstore from them. In the process, she uses up all her savings. So now she can't leave. Also, she's convinced she sees no reason to leave. She's not scared of the Germans. She wants to keep this bookstore running for her friends. So that's her reason for leaving. Paul Aubrey is an American automaker. He actually wants to leave. His wife just passed away. He wants to take his little girl and go home and forget France. But the US military convinces him to stay because his new customers are Germans. And they're buying things that they might have some information that might be interesting to the US military. So he ends up being kind of an unofficial spy and sending information through the US embassy to the US military. So, but to do that, he has to look like he approves of the Germans and approves of what they're doing. And he has to make friends with the Germans and slides up to them because they give him some really interesting information. But with the other Americans who oppose the Nazis, they don't think much of Paul now because he's one of them. So he has to make quite a sacrifice to his reputation, and he's a very social creature. So it's very difficult for him to suddenly have no friends because he's always been surrounded by friends. It's a difficult decision that he makes. So then he meets Lucy and likes her very much, but she finds out that he's selling to the Germans, and she thinks nothing of that.
So did you do, a lot of research on Spies of that time period, or?
Yeah, not as much into the spying. That's a whole nother world with the SOE and the OSS. And in reality, in that early in the war, the Americans and British were actually not the Americans, because the Americans were still neutral, but the British were just starting to get the SOE going. I'm trying to remember when they sent their first spies in, and I don't think it might have been late 1941, and I'm blanking on the date, but they were just reeling. I mean, France was just starting, the idea of resistance was foreign. Nobody knew it wasn't like, okay, well, this is how they did it in the past when they were occupied. This is how we resist. Nobody had done this. So the concept of resistance was brand new. And when France was conquered, they were just demoralized. They were numb. They were ashamed. They were, all these negative things. So the thought of resisting was just so far off for them. So it wasn't until mid to late 1941, that they really started getting some organization going. It really started with the communists. It's so funny because I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and the communist wars, the bad guys, and it was the Cold War. And so we like to look at the resistance movements of Europe and say, well, there are people like us, and actually you should start with the communists. So because they were so diametrically opposed to the Nazis. But anyway, so they started with the communists, but then it grew and it expanded into other walks of society. But the concept of well, how do you pass messages clandestinely so you don't get caught? Code names and code phrases, all these things were things they kind of had to make up. And so I started the story kind of in the middle of it, in the early parts of it in 1941, where they were just trying to get their feet under them. And we should resist. Should we resist or shouldn't we resist? Yes, we should. Well, how do we do this? How do we do this and live? And so as far as study, because you hear the great stories of the spies of World War II, and almost all of them, you hear these stories, and they're really 1944, 1945, because by then the SOE and the OSS were really well-oiled machines, and they knew how to train their spies, and they're sending them in. Granted, a horrific number of them were killed, just a horrific number. But by then they had this machinery in place of cranking out these spies and getting them here, getting them there, and doing the work. And they actually did some it's really incredible work, but most of it was later in the war. So, so there was this tension between knowing how people acted later in the war and knowing that my story was set earlier in the war when they were still figuring these things out. So trying to be accurate to that time period. But what Paul was doing was definitely kind of, outside even the usual spy network. So it was just definitely kind of the military attaché saying, "Hey, send me what you hear," and he had a method of doing that. But he was just really kind of making that up on the fly. But one thing I did have in there that was real was the American hospital in Paris. And they were, from the beginning, from the fall of France, they were sheltering French soldiers that the Germans wanted to cart off to POW camps. They started harboring Allied airmen who were shot down. And so because it was this weird relationship they had, especially when America was neutral, the Germans didn't come into their hospital. So they had this incredible network going where they were sheltering these men and then feeding them into the escape lines to get them back to Britain to fly again. So these were Americans and French. There were a lot of French who worked at the hospital who were already doing that work that early. So I was able to work in the American hospital, and the work that they were doing, I was able to work that into my story because it was just too interesting not to have in there.
Yeah, I so enjoy seeing all the intricacies that went on during this time period and during the war. And did you find it, did anything stand out to you in your research for either book? Oh
goodness, I don't know where to begin. There's so much, and it's so funny because you go in. I mean, I have been writing World War II novels for 20 years now, though I've only been published for 12, but I've been researching World War II for 20 years now. And each year you think okay, now I'm pretty well grounded in this stuff. And then I start researching another aspect, I had no idea. And especially with Until Leaves Fall in Paris, I definitely had these ideas of how things were in France. And how many of us have heard about, the French, I surrender, they surrendered really easily. They just let the Germans walk all over them. And so we have this, I think we called them something about surrender monkeys. That was a big term a few years ago. And the French, they just lie down, let the Germans walk all over them. And it wasn't true. They actually fought super, super hard. And a lot of them felt that the British betrayed them. When the British left Dunkirk, in the British story, that is a huge victory, snatching victory out of defeat. And the French said, well, you left Dunkirk, but you didn't come back to France to fight like you promised. So they stayed in Britain. And so the French saw that as a betrayal. To the British, it was victory, and they were conserving their men so that if they were invaded, they had an army to fight. So for the British point of view, that was the best choice to make. For the French, they saw it as a cruel betrayal. But so that was a new idea for me. I think a lot of the histories we read are written definitely from the British point of view. So I'm not reading as many from the French point of view. So that was very interesting to me. But then reading about how hard they fought, they had some horrible leadership. But individual units and individuals fought very well and very hard. And there were some incredibly well-fought battles by the French during the fall. So that was I was glad to hear that because I like having bad notions overthrown. So, when I have these opinions in my head and that's how things were. And then I hear the opposite, no, I'm glad I know both sides. So that was interesting.
So how many books are you finding all of this out in books or Google or what?
Yeah, books, websites, and obviously with Google, you have to be careful because it can send you everywhere. I often do start with Wikipedia just to get a general impression and then go from there. I mean, that's kind of a great way to get a start. What was France like in World War II? Well, Wikipedia has a very long article about France in World War II, which gives me some of the basics. But really, at that point, I need to start finding good websites, primary documents when I can. That can be harder to do. I don't have access to a research library. And because of COVID, I wasn't able to go to France. Thank you, COVID. So, a lot of books, and then books. The best part about books is the bibliographies for me, because the bibliographies will lead me on. Sometimes that will take me to a primary source. Museums are often incredible sources because they will oftentimes they have a lot of information on their websites, or will link you to other sites. So I love museums because they can really be great resources. And they will, because they love their subject so much, they're only going to send you to the good websites. So